It is now my honor to introduce the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, the Honorable Robert L. Wilkie, Jr., who 1 year ago today was confirmed by the Senate to lead our nation's second largest federal department. Since being sworn into office a week later, he and his department have faced a host of challenges, from fending off privatization claims to implementing the VA Mission Act, improving the appeals process for VA claims, modernizing the electronic health records system, helping veterans transition back into civilian life, and combating veteran suicide. Let there be no doubt that the VFW regards the VA as an irreplaceable national resource that cannot, I repeat, cannot be replicated by a civilian healthcare system that also has waiting lists, and by civilian doctors who can augment but not replace the continuity and continuum of care that only our VA is capable of providing to America's veterans. I say our VA because 100 years ago, our forefathers created the VFW Washington office to petition Congress for veterans' benefits and to ensure those benefits were properly provided. To say our services are needed just as much today as they were 100 years ago is an understatement. But it's a job we willingly take, which is why our international cadre of more than 2,100 accredited service officers helped more than 526,000 veterans to recoup more than $8.3 billion in earned disability compensation and pension in 2018, to include thousands of transitioning service members on the 24 military installations we service. The Secretary spent his youth at Fort Bragg as the son of an Army artillery officer. Today, Secretary Wilkie is also known as Colonel Wilkie in the Air Force Reserve, and he previously served in the Navy Reserve as an intelligence officer. Prior to joining the VA, he served under Defense Secretary Jim Mattis as the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, a position portfolio that included force readiness, Guard and Reserve Component Affairs, training, personal requirements and management, and equal opportunity, MWR, and military family quality of life programs. He also oversaw the military health care, so he understands that bad press about one military hospital is not a blank statement against all military hospitals, which is an unfortunate perception that can apply to the VA too. He served as the acting VA Secretary for a month and a half prior to his nomination. During that time, he was often seen walking the post inside the VA, getting down into the trenches and talking with the troops. I see that as positive, because you can't restore the faith of veterans in their VA unless you communicate and improve the morale of the employees who accomplish the mission. Please welcome the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, the Honorable Robert Wilkie.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to your national commander. When President Trump announced the formation of the Prevents Task Force on veteran suicide, the VFW was there, and BJ was standing next to the president when he signed that very important and long overdue executive order. So I thank you very much for that. And thank you to your national leaders, but there is one person I want to single out. In the 1960s, as many of you know, the focal point of the fight in Vietnam was in Hue City, as Marines fought wave after wave of North Vietnamese troops to defend Vietnam's ancient capital. And there was one Marine there who stood out, not only because of his enormous stature, but because he was in the front line leading other young Marines in that desperate battle. For the last 18 years, he has been your legislative director in Washington, D.C., leading the fight on an equally dangerous hill, Capitol Hill. And when I was thinking about Bob's service, I thought about the great airborne General Matthew Ridgway. In 1986, Ronald Reagan gave General Ridgway the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and he said, "Heroes come when they are needed, and great men come when courage seems in short supply." Bob Wallace is both a hero and a great man, and I thank him for everything he has done for his country. Well, we celebrated two anniversaries this year. The 75th anniversary of the assault on Hitler's fortress Europe, and the 75th anniversary of the signing of the GI Bill by President Roosevelt, the most transformative piece of legislation outside of the Civil Rights Act in the history of the United States. I celebrated a more somber anniversary. Some of you who've heard me speak know that I talk a little bit about growing up at Fort Sill and Fort Bragg and the experiences I had as a kindergarten and elementary school student, because there were often times when my classmates were called to the principal's office, and it wasn't because they were going to a doctor's appointment. They had received bad news from Southeast Asia. That is what happened on April 4th of 1975. We were in the last days of the fight in Southeast Asia, and President Ford ordered the evacuation of all of the orphanages in Saigon. It was called Operation Baby Lift. One of those Air Force sergeants who volunteered was a fellow named Denning Cicero Johnson of Harnett County, North Carolina. He was on the C-5, the last one that lifted off from Tan Son Nhut on April 4th. A faulty cargo door forced that plane down. 138 lost their lives. 11 of them were airmen, including Sergeant Johnson. On April 4th of this year, I escorted his daughter Denise, my friend and classmate, to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial 44 years after that day, and she touched her father's name on the last row of the last panel, 1W, the center of the memorial. So much has changed since those times, and changed for the better. In my childhood memories of Vietnam, my father was gravely wounded in the invasion of Cambodia. He returned to us after a year in an Army hospital weighing half of what he did when he went. 2 years later, he returned to Fort Bragg as a senior officer in the All-American Division. But even for someone wearing the red beret, the times were hostile. He was not even allowed to wear his uniform off of Fort Bragg. Those times have changed, and they've changed in part because of the tireless and selfless service of the VFW. We are in a pro-veteran country now. When I look around, I see people who welcome warriors home. I see people standing for veterans at the Little League and at Major Leagues. Videos of veterans surprising their children at school have become a national phenomenon. It seems that even most in Hollywood are pro-veteran. And in a political climate when Republicans and Democrats can't agree on the time of day, the one thing that they are certain about is support for those who who have borne the battle. This organization played an important and pivotal role in changing the culture of the United States of America, and I thank you on behalf of a grateful country. The VFW knows something about where we came from and the importance of reminding us all of America's history. As BJ mentioned, this organization was born 120 years ago, and this is your 100th anniversary in dealing with the ins and outs of Washington on behalf of America's warriors. You helped establish the legacy that I am privileged to be part of today, to make sure that we memorialize veterans' service across the generations and for all time with a robust, vibrant, and ever-living Department of Veterans Affairs. But there's something else that is happening across the country that reinforces the importance of what you do. Many of the burdens borne by America's veterans are now the same issues that all of America is facing. Things like suicide, opioid abuse, and your VA is playing an important role in the President's fight to tackle these terrible issues. As BJ knows, suicide prevention is the President's #1 VA priority. As long as we are still seeing veterans struggle, it is our duty to help them find their way back into the community of brotherhood and family. They need our love and support. As this group too well knows, 20 American veterans take their lives every day. About half of these warriors are people over the age of 50, and most of those are from the Vietnam era. To put that in perspective, Lyndon Johnson left Washington, D.C. 50 years ago in January, and we are still dealing with the effects of that terrible conflict. Of the 20 veterans who commit that tragic act, we only see 6. But here is what we are doing for the 6 we do see. Veterans who walk through our doors for health care will be screened for mental health. Since October 1st, we have screened 900,000 of your fellow veterans. We also provide same-day mental health care. And just as importantly, we are talking about this issue within the Department of Defense. The practice of my father's generation, not to talk about these problems, is giving way to an open discussion among our service members who have learned the importance of looking after each other. But no secretary of this department can solve this problem from Washington, D.C., especially when most of those we seek to find are not in our VA. This problem is bigger than one program or one department or even the whole of government. And I'm going to need the help of your membership and every other VSO and NGO in America if we are going to solve this nationwide tragedy that's affecting both veterans and non-veterans. Our country will not get anywhere on veteran suicide until it finally has a national conversation about life, and that is a conversation you can start today. You know, in a perfect world, our veterans would not be surrounded by government programs. They would be surrounded by family, friends, and neighbors. So veterans can play a big part, a big role, to talk about the value of carrying on amongst peers. And that discussion is probably the most powerful tool that we have. In the meantime, the President has empowered your department to be the tip of the spear in this effort from the government side. In March, as BJ knows, he signed an executive order creating a task force that will create a national strategy for reducing veteran suicide. I co-chair the task force, and I'm honored in that capacity to start this conversation in Washington with the President's cabinet. But we will not simply focus on the last tragic act of a veteran's life. If we do this, this will be another Washington report that will serve as a doorstop for future generations. If we do not talk about mental health, and I've said before, this country isn't even at the Sputnik stage when it comes to talking about mental health across our country. If we don't focus on mental health, addiction, and homelessness, we will never get a handle on suicide amongst veterans. Now, one result I do expect is the creation of a template for how government, BSOs, and NGOs and companies can work together to identify those who are at risk and get them the help that we need. We've done this before in our battle to end veterans' homelessness, and I think it is the key to making progress on veteran suicide. We made progress by working hand in hand with you and local officials to identify those veterans who are homeless or who might soon be homeless. That has yielded incredible results in dozens of communities across the nation. Cities the size of Houston and Jacksonville and Atlanta have eliminated veterans' homelessness, and we think we can repeat that kind of success by finding local partners who finally understand the turmoils that our veterans suffer. Opioid addiction is another factor that has hit both veterans and the rest of the country, and it's another issue in which VA is leading the way. When I was in the White House with President Trump last month, I was privileged to tell him that we have reduced our opioid prescriptions by 51%, and we are continuing to make progress. We are also looking at other options that would have never been considered in my father's era. Alternatives to opioids like Tai Chi and yoga and acupuncture. If I had told my father that we would treat the terrible pains that he left the service with acupuncture and yoga, my nose would have been flat against my face. But the culture has changed, and you have helped change it. As I noted earlier, VA is also at the center of another transformative period, the implementation of the Mission Act. The Mission Act makes the greatest changes in the way VA operates since General Bradley sat in the desk that I now occupy. But while General Bradley gave us the modern VA system, Trump has allowed us to revolutionize the way we look at veterans by saying it is the VA's job to fit the needs of the veteran. It is not the veteran's job to fit the needs of VA's bureaucracy. Under the Mission Act, veterans can get care in the community if a VA facility is too long of a drive, and if it doesn't have the care that they need, and only we act when it is in the best interest of the veteran. And it finally gives the veteran what all of your neighbors have had, and that is the option of using urgent care close by without having to drive several hours to reach the VA. One veteran in Kansas has already said this change is a godsend, since it means I don't have to drive 2 hours each day to see a VA doctor when I have a sore throat. Now, some fear that the VA's Mission Act means privatization and the end of the Veterans Affairs Department as we know it. But I was privileged to present to the Congress in March the largest budget in the history of this department. I am a pariah in the cabinet room because I'm the only one who was told specifically by the President of the United States, you don't have to come up with budget cuts. $220 billion calling for a workforce of 390,000 Americans is no way to privatize an organization. When some people warn that the private sector will put the VA out of business, I will tell you, after a lifetime of watching veterans and being part of your community, Veterans want to go where people understand the culture and speak the language. That can never and will never be duplicated in the private sector. And veterans are voting with their feet. We had 44,000 calls to VA on the first day of the Mission Act, June 6th of this year. But most of those calls were asking questions about urgent care. They weren't asking questions about how to get into the private sector for specialty care or primary care. Why? Because our veteran satisfaction rates now sit at 89.7%. There is nothing, absolutely nothing in the private sector that comes close to that. And veterans are choosing VA because that is where they want to be. So, what is coming for us? Our VA population is changing. When my father was commissioned 2 months before President Kennedy was inaugurated, the number of women in the Department of Defense was less than 0.5%. When I was the Undersecretary of Defense under General Mattis, the percentage of American women in uniform on active duty was 17% and is going to 20% by 2025. What does that mean for the VA? It means that today, 10% of those we serve are American women, and that number will reach 20% in the next few years. Our budget is changing. $9.5 billion was spent last year to provide health services for America's women, and I expect that number to go higher. America's women veterans are more likely to receive breast cancer and cervical cancer screening in VA than they will ever get in the private sector, and we are very proud of that. So as I said, while Mission Act has changed, giving veterans more choice, it is our goal to make that choice a tough choice. And we know, by the way veterans are acting, that choice for them to decide between our VA and the private sector is getting tougher every day because we are improving every day. And I thank you and I thank the President for the leadership. One last thing. We are embarking on January 1st on finally taking care of those in the Blue Water Navy from Vietnam. We are following the law passed by Congress, which requires us to implement those benefits on the first day of 2020. As we speak, we are focused on training and hiring and putting in place the policies and procedures needed to process claims and provide the benefits that you deserve once the new year hits. We will be ready to assist our Blue Water Navy veterans. In the meantime, I ask the VFW, and I mentioned this to Bob Wallace, to please encourage your fellow warriors to set the conditions now for the claims that they will be filing, and we will be ready to take care of them. So, Blue Water, Mission Act, veterans approval, these are your victories. They don't belong to any president. They don't belong to any federal department. I am grateful to the VFW not only for strengthening our work at VA, but because you deliver something else to veterans that is not ours to give. A community that exists outside of the federal government, a community that cares about veterans when they return, when they fight, and at every stage of their lives. Working together, we can fulfill President Lincoln's charge to care for those who have borne the battle and heed another one of my favorite lessons from World War II. I mentioned the greatest of airborne warriors, General Matthew Ridgway, who led the All-American Division in North Africa and Sicily and planned the airborne assault on Hitler's fortress Europe by the Screaming Eagles in the All-American Division on June 5th, 1944. He wasn't allowed to go with the division and the Corps that day. And he was behind in England, and he slept restlessly in his cot. And he actually fell out of his cot. He was so distressed. And he reached for the Old Testament. And he reached to the book of Joshua, to the greatest battle in the history of the Hebrew people. And he pulled down the reference to God's promise to Joshua, that I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. That is our shared cause, VA and the VFW, to not fail or forsake those who have experienced the incommunicable experience of war, those 41 million Americans who, since the first shot was fired at Lexington Green in 1775, have never failed nor forgot their country. I thank VFW for everything you have meant to this republic. I thank you for what you mean to your fellow warriors. God bless you and this great organization, and thank you for the honor of having me. Thank you all very much. That's not a bad salute for an Air Force officer, is it? Thank you all very much.